Sorry, guys. Okay, so case study design. So a lot of people have already mentioned that in your research proposal that you are considering using more than one data source, maybe interviews plus a survey, maybe observations plus an interview. So in case study design, using multiple data sources is very common. And then also documents. So if you are looking at a particular school that is really successful, you might do a case study to try to understand what's happening that's making the school so successful. And if it's a qualitative case study, you might observe the school, you might interview some of the teachers, parents, and students, and you might collect some of their documents, the lesson plans, student artifacts, to try to get a picture of what's happening there. And then in chapter 16, the authors discuss ethnography, phenomenology, and grounded theory. So okay, that's not gonna work. So in ethnography is a it's a qualitative method that came out of anthropology. And since it is a method that derived from anthropology, the main aim is to understand culture. And traditionally, historically, in my opinion, it's problematic in that it was oftentimes a westernized approach to understanding the other, looking from an anthropological perspective of indigenous communities in different places. And so with that, with the Eurocentric and westernized researcher looking in at other cultures, there are a lot of issues with it, but it still is a research method that's used even in education. In education, and ethnography is when the researcher immerses themselves, is the language that you'll hear, immerses themselves in a particular context for an extended period of time, usually like a year. It says here a month to a year. So if an educational researcher wants to do an ethnography of a school, they would be going to that school almost daily for probably a year. And there's different types of ethnography. There could be a participant observer. Observation is the main mode of data collection in ethnography. And so the researcher might be joining in the community or participating to try to, over time, really understand the cultural characteristics of a particular place. Now, phenomenology comes from philosophy, and it is concerned with understanding the essence of a particular experience. So there is, and you will see crossover between these different designs. So narrative inquiry is using storytelling or narrative structure to understand a particular experience, but phenomenology is using interviews, that's the data collection, to try to find a commonality across people for a particular experience. So you might have like a study that's a phenomenological study of being a grad student while being a full-time teacher. And so through collecting interviews with a variety of participants, and you can see it's not too many, maybe 5 to 10, you try to find, and it's understanding that people do have different experiences, but trying to hone in on the essence of what that experience is like. So that is the aim of phenomenology. So an example here is like, you might, an example would be like the experience of grief, going through the death of a loved one and using interviews to describe what the essence of that experience is like. So depending on your research goal, you might choose phenomenology or you might choose narrative inquiry. So the main difference between them is phenomenology is trying to look for commonalities, where narrative inquiry is more concerned with understanding people's experience in this narrative structure. And then lastly is grounded theory. And grounded theory is based on is traditionally from sociology, and it is very prevalent in terms of its influence. So grounded theory is not so commonly used, but different elements of it are. So grounded theory is the most procedural. It has the most rules out of any of the qualitative methods. And its intention, it's also unique in it is intended to create theories. So we know that qualitative design is exploratory. You're collecting data and then exploring the data to understand a phenomenon or an experience. Grounded theory is collecting data to try to create a theory. So you'll hear language like the theory emerged from the data. So in grounded theory, there are interviews and there's a very specific analysis process. And this analysis process is listed here. It has open coding, axial coding, and then selective coding. We'll get more into this when we do the data analysis. But even many studies that are not grounded theory, they draw from what's known as grounded theory methods to analyze the data and even for data collection. So anytime in the theory can give you a hint in that grounded theory is the only qualitative design that its aim or its goal is to develop a theory based on the qualitative data that is collected. Okay, so with this table, so your research purpose is here, and then the data collection that is used for this. So as you can see, most of them use interviews. Ethnography is participant observation. Again, the researcher is going to immerse themselves in that context and be going to that site on a very frequent basis. And then case study is going to have multiple methods. And then down here, you can see what it's going to look like when it says narrative report. This means what is the finding section going to look like in the research paper? So just like we just did in our quantitative article critique, in the finding section, they had their statistical analysis and they talked about whether or not their hypothesis was statistically, if they had evidence that it statistically significant evidence to support their hypothesis. But in a qualitative paper, the findings section are a little bit different. So in phenomenology, you'll see a description, since it's focused on understanding the essence of a particular experience. They'll have a lot of description of the common characteristics or the essence of that experience, and they'll have quotes. So these research methods that rely on interviews, in the findings section, they have quotes from the participants to illustrate or show you examples that communicate the findings that they found. In ethnography, you'll see a description of the context and the cultural themes and characteristics that they discovered. And then case study, a description of the context and the different relationships or characteristics of that particular case. And then in grounded theory, it will have, it will use quotes from the data to explain the theory that came out of their analytic process. And then narrative inquiry, it will often have large excerpts of those stories that participants were telling to, again, illustrate the analysis and the themes that they found. So just to give you a picture, this week doesn't have analysis, but when qualitative researchers collect data, so let's say it's an interview, they'll collect an interview with a participant. It might be an hour, hour and a half. And we already know with IRB, they will already have the participant agree, and they will record the interview. And then they transcribe the interview, and then they can upload it into the computer or even print it out. And then they do what's called coding. You see that with the grounded theory. They're reading through small chunks of text and assigning each chunk of text meaning. It's kind of like, you can think of it like hashtags on Twitter. So they're reading through a section and assigning it a hashtag, and then going through that multiple times to try to come up with a set of themes that represent the big ideas in the text and any relationships in there. So we will go more in depth to what that looks like, but just so you can get an idea of how the researcher goes from interview to analysis to the report. So that was kind of a high-level overview of those 5 major approaches, but are there any questions that you have at this point, or components you want me to explain further? Good.
Are there any major cons to any of them? Like something we should, yeah, any major cons?
Yes. So, I mean, this is going to be my opinion, but so anytime that you are doing, okay, so anytime you're doing, in my opinion, any research, but it's definitely an expectation in qualitative research. The researcher is, and this is related to the philosophy portion that you'll read at the beginning of the chapter, all of us, when we make meaning out of something we read, a conversation that we have, we bring our whole life's experience into that interaction. And so if you're the researcher, if you're doing an interview, even your body language, your questions is going to impact that person. Then when you go through with the interview transcript and you read through it and you look for the big ideas, and then when you go to write about it, you're going to write about what you think is important. So just, we call that reflexivity. So it's so important that the researcher be constantly reflecting in their self, like your own positionality. Even me as a teacher of this class, I'm a white woman, I'm all of these things impact all of our interactions. So it's essential that qualitative researchers are thinking about that and then including that. It's called like a reflexivity statement, talking about their own positionality, their own relationships with participants. You know, it's kind of like if a tree falls in a forest, like if you're doing like an observation, just stepping into that classroom changes the dynamic. So being aware of that is super important. And then also for ethnography too, like I mentioned, the traditional way that it's done, in my opinion, is pretty problematic. Trying to understand the other, and typically it's done from a, you know, that's why I don't use the word like savage, because that was really common out of the traditional anthropology and ethnography describing other cultures. And really it was just ignorance, but using that, you know, some of that power, like research can be very powerful in a way that's damaging. And so I think that that's why I like qualitative research, because it gives you the space to kind of talk about a lot of these issues and kind of question some of the claims that we have, and especially in education too. You know, thinking about, especially I'm thinking about your study too, the achievement gap and all of these statistics that we see, but like kind of getting into that, the why, who is coming up with all those things. So qualitative research, you asked me to say the cons, and now I'm talking about the possibilities, but you know, some people will see that as a con, like, you know.
No, I'm about to say I understand exactly, because almost like your biases, because
Yes,
you're bringing, you know, who your past experiences, and that can reflect again how you,
yes.
your body language and how you interpret how a person said it, and you know,
Yeah.
yeah.
I
So
think
that
your
was
bias,
very, thank you.
I think your biases affect you in quantitative design too. They just don't always say it. But, and then another con is it can be very time consuming. So if you're doing quantitative research, you know, you're doing statistical methods, you might use the Georgia milestone scores. And, you know, not that it's easy by any means, but it's a little less tedious versus like going line by line from 20 pages of transcript and coding, or even collecting the data. If you're interviewing 15 people, you know, that's very time consuming. So time consuming. And so that's another con, a reason why it's not used as often. If you think about like funding from companies or colleges, a grant, you know, it can be expensive to pay for all of the people that it's required to collect that data. it'll be interesting to see how that changes with AI. But and then other cons, and then, the time for ethnography, if you're supposed to go for a year, you really have to be super committed. In the lecture, I talked about a couple of my favorite ethnographies. Have you guys heard of, has anyone watched the lecture yet? I don't want to ruin. And I can't remember if it's in this one or the next one, but we've all heard of culturally relevant pedagogy. So that theory came out of the research Gloria Ladson-Billings, and it was a qualitative study. So she found teachers who were successful at teaching African-American students. She interviewed them, she observed them over a school year, multiple interviews, multiple observations. And then in analyzing her field notes, so if you do an observation, you're expected to take detailed notes. I guess you would type probably now, but and then you would go back and analyze. And so through her analysis, she came up with these characteristics that all the teachers shared that she argues lead to effective practice with Black students. And so now we have that today, culturally relevant pedagogy. So I'm sorry, I'm talking about cons. But
No, but all that's helpful. I think at least for me it is. It's still relevant and it's very helpful. Thank you.
yeah,
No, no.
but it's not necessarily like you don't have that, well, what works? People want, just tell me what to do and I'll do it. It's not necessarily that simple. So that could be a con too, in a way. Let's see other cons. Just the feasibility, and then participants too. Participants have to agree to participate. And so, it's just limited. You have to really, but in my opinion, all research, you're only getting a glimpse at what's really happening, because we want to respect people's privacy, but who doesn't want to participate in research? And we did that in the ethics chapter, and all of that knowledge that we might not be including for a variety of reasons. So that was a good question and a very long answer, sorry. Any other questions or topics you want me to go over? Okay, well, I'm excited to hear what you think. And as we get into the article critiques too, you will get a chance to see some more of those. What happened to my Okay, I think I closed the lesson. Do y'all want to go over the questions or?
I think I'm good. I was planning on going through the perusal this evening, but if somebody else wants to, I like to go through the questions, see if I get them correct first. But if somebody else wants to go through them,
Okay, yeah, that makes sense, just to practice. And then let me show you too, there is this handout too that'll be helpful. That's in the review questions that you can always use to study, that it has the 12 major characteristics of qualitative research. And then this is similar to that same table as well. So yeah, there's a lot of good stuff there. But I'm also going to put the research proposal template in the chat, or the sample, because the sample is a qualitative example. Okay, well, I put that, again, the research proposal, that is a qualitative design if you want to see what that looks like. Yeah. And if there's no other questions, you guys can go enjoy the sunshine or just being inside.
Yeah, that example is very helpful, by the way. Thank you.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Martin.
You guys are
Thank
awesome.
you, Dr. Martin.
Yes, it's always good to see you all.
Thank you.
Email me if you have any questions or think of anything else.
Yes,
Thank
ma'am. Have
you.
a good
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.